So the other day, Venerable Jampa shared a creation story by a Native American tribe about how suffering and evil had entered the world. And this inspired me to look at the creation story that I'm most familiar with and to try to find any parallels that it has with Buddhism. But first, I wanted to share a photo that makes clear that this story is not something that's just theoretical, but something that has had a significant impact on my life, and I'm sure almost everybody else's lives here too. So my uncle Reggie, he died earlier this year of heart disease, and my mother sent me pictures of him attending my baptism. And so this is a picture of me at my baptism, about 1 year old. And of course, I really don't remember much of what happened, but my mom said that I kept crying because the water kept going into my eyes during the baptism. So everybody here looks pretty happy. But actually, the reason why we're all gathered there is not so cheerful. And that reason can be found in the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis in the Christian Bible. So Adam and Eve is a creation story that's shared by all of the Abrahamic religions. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. Whether this includes Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And this story provides the basis for the doctrines of the fall of mankind and original sin that are important beliefs in Christianity. However, these beliefs are not held in Judaism or Islam. Lucky them. So most people, I think, are familiar with this story or myth, as it's often referred to, but there are some slight variations, so I want to share the version that I was taught while attending Catholic education classes as a child. So the story starts with an all-powerful and all-knowing God who was so full of love and generosity that he decided to create the universe. And then he also created Adam and Eve. And he did this by making them out of dirt or clay and then breathing life into them. And then in a separate version, he takes one of the ribs of Adam and he makes that into Eve. And Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden, and this was basically a paradise that was free from all suffering. God provided them with everything that they needed to survive and to thrive. There was no violence, and they lived in complete peace with all of God's other creations. They felt completely at one with God and with their surroundings, and best of all, they were immortal. However, it seems that God designed the Garden of Eden as a kind of test because he also placed within it one tree that he forbade Adam and Eve to eat from. And this tree was ominously called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he also created a serpent that had no other function than to be a troublemaker. And the serpent was eventually able to convince Eve that it was in her and Adam's best interest to eat the fruit from the forbidden tree. So, from what I remember, at first Eve resisted the serpent's suggestions because she trusted God and she wanted to stay in his good graces because he had been so kind to them. However, the serpent was an excellent manipulator and master of argumentation, and he was able to create a sense of distrust and separation in Eve's mind, saying that God didn't really love them and that he was withholding important information from them. Then the serpent promised them that by eating the fruit, Adam and Eve could become just like God by finding out what only he knew. This sounded like a pretty good deal, so Eve plucked one of the fruits from the tree, went like that, I can't do it because it's precept day, and then handed the apple or the fruit to Adam, who then also took a bite. So I think we all know what happens after they took the bite. Instead of becoming omniscient, their minds were filled with fear. And of course, God knew what had happened, and he got really angry. And just like that, Adam and Eve lost their favored status with God, and they had to face what all human beings have since known as the real world. So God banished them from Garden of Eden, and they ventured out into a dangerous and inhospitable environment. Adam and Eve now suffered from cold, from heat, from hunger and thirst. They had to kill animals to get food, and they were vulnerable to attacks by wild animals. And worst of all, they would now get old, sick, and die instead of enjoying eternal life. And God gave Eve an especially severe punishment for having been the first to eat the fruit. And this was having to undergo childbirth and also to be subordinate to her husband, because initially they were equals. And Adam and Eve also now had to wear clothes because they were embarrassed by their nakedness. This series of events in the story is called The Fall of Humankind, and Christians believe that all human beings are born with original sin on their soul as a result of Adam and Eve's disobedience. And this means that they're born into a condition of sinfulness and must await redemption by a Savior in order to be reunited with God in heaven. Now, I was interested to read that the doctrine of original sin is not held in Judaism or the Orthodox Christian churches. And I was especially amazed to read that the concept of original sin does not exist in Islam, because in Islam, God forgave Adam and Eve for what they had done. So the ritual of baptism is supposed to remove original sin from the soul, but for some reason, the baptized person doesn't live a carefree life from that point on, which I myself can attest to. So that's the summary of the story. And now, being a Buddhist, I want to try and tease out elements that I think are similar to Buddhist teachings on why human beings suffer and what the solution to our problems are. So I've actually thought about this for a long time, but in the recent course we had with Geshe Dadul, he mentioned that he found it was ironic that Adam and Eve's desire for the apple was the reason attributed to human suffering. So in Buddhism, desire and craving are held to be the chief reason that human beings, and actually all sentient beings, are trapped in cyclic existence. Self-grasping ignorance is the root cause of why we're here in the first place, but without craving and desire, future rebirths are not possible. And actually, in the Christian tradition, the main affliction that drove Adam and Eve to disobey God was not desire, but rather pride. They had eaten the apple mainly because they wanted the same status and power as God, and no longer wanted to be his inferior. I think one of the and pride is also a very terrible affliction in Buddhism, one of the 5 root afflictions. One of the most interesting aspects of the story is the sense of being a separate self that arose in Adam and Eve just before they ate the apple, and especially after they ate the apple. This sense became even more acute and more painful. So they had started out in a state of complete interconnectedness and interdependence with God, with each other, and with everyone in their environment. Only goodness existed, and they had no idea of what evil or suffering meant. But the serpent was able to introduce a dualistic and self-centered way of thinking into their minds that put God and his interests on one side and themselves and their own interests on another side. And Buddhism teaches that the dualistic way of thinking that all human beings have, where the world is divided into self and to other, is due to the self-grasping ignorance in our minds. Self-grasping ignorance makes us believe that we are separate, autonomous, and independent selves that do not depend on anything else to exist. And likewise, all other phenomena exist in this way too. And this way of misinterpreting the world causes all the other mental afflictions to arise, the main ones being attachment and anger, as well as the self-centered attitude, where we believe our own happiness is more important than anybody else's. And then we spend our whole lives chasing after what we think will make us happy and trying to get away from what we think is causing us to suffer, but we're never successful in any of our attempts. We classify other beings as either friends, enemies, or strangers, and then act in destructive ways that only bring suffering to them and to ourselves. And then the only way to overcome this false sense of a self that is the root of our problems is to directly realize emptiness, which is the true nature of how all things, including ourselves, exist. I find it really fascinating to think that Christianity posits a time when the human mind was completely free of suffering, of self-centeredness or fear. Adam and Eve lived in complete harmony with their environment and shared in God's unconditional love, compassion, and generosity. And to me, this description of the state of their minds reminds me a lot of Buddha nature, which is the idea that the minds of all sentient beings are naturally pure, and that ignorance and all the other afflictions are foreign elements that can be removed. And by cultivating positive qualities like love, compassion, generosity, and wisdom, we're able to restore our minds back to their basic state of purity. And Christianity also prescribes many similar practices involving developing love and compassion in order to make our way back to heaven and achieve everlasting happiness. And the last parallel I want to mention is that thankfully for both religions, the human situation is actually not as bad as it may appear. There is a way out of suffering, though the paths that each faith prescribes are quite different. However, in both of them, a teacher has appeared out of compassion for the world and taught them how to transform their minds and their hearts. So in Christianity, salvation from eternal suffering is only possible to the emergence of Christ and the sacrifice that he made to free all humans of their sins. And in Buddhism, we also acknowledge that sentient beings would be unable to get out of samsara unless a Buddha appears and teaches the Dharma out of compassion. And in both religions, human beings play a central role in deciding whether to follow this path that will lead them out of suffering to a state of lasting peace and happiness, whether that be a reunion with God or understanding the true nature of reality. Oh, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, encourages people to stay with the religion that they were raised in, if it's an authentic one that teaches values like love, compassion, ethics, generosity, and so on. And this is because the religion that we were exposed to while growing up leaves very deep and powerful imprints on our minds. However, if that religion doesn't make sense, or we find that another religion is more suited to us, then the Dalai Lama encourages us to practice that new religion. So by revisiting the story of Adam and Eve, I'm sort of hoping to build a bridge between these two faiths that have had a very big impact on my life, and to celebrate the fact that all human beings have the same aspiration to live in peace, harmony, and connection.